My name is Brittany, and for 27 years, I lived my life as a secondary character in my own story. I was a ghost haunting the hallways of other people's expectations, a vessel for my parents' demands, a punching bag for a corporate machine that didn't know my name. I had spent years, lifetimes, it felt like, imagining the moment I would finally breathe without that invisible iron band of pressure crushing my ribs. I would close my eyes in the middle of another endless staff meeting or another forced family dinner and picture the day I would choose myself without apology, without the guilt that usually followed any act of self-preservation like a dark shadow. That moment arrived quietly, without fanfare, on a Tuesday morning when I quit my job. There was no dramatic speech, no movie moment where I told my boss exactly what I thought of his condescending emails. There was no slammed door, no chaotic exit. It was just a calm, three-sentence email and a trembling finger hovering over the send button, my heart hammering against my sternum like a trapped bird. For years, I had worked overtime until my vision blurred, swallowed insults from clients who treated me like dirt, and lived inside a schedule that treated my life, my health, and my sanity like an afterthought, a necessary sacrifice to the gods of stability. I told myself it was temporary. I whispered it like a mantra in the dark. That exhaustion was the price of stability, that the migraine was just stress, that the numbness was just adulthood. But stability never came. Only deeper fatigue, a soul-deep weariness that made my bones feel like lead. So I walked away. I walked away from the steady paycheck, from the health insurance, from the identity I had built as the reliable one, the hard worker, the girl who gets it done. It was terrifying. It was 3 weeks later, after draining my savings account down to the frightening digits and terrifying every practical, logical voice in my head that screamed about retirement and safety nets, that I did something that felt clinically insane. I bought my dream beach house to heal. It wasn't a mansion, not the kind splashed across lifestyle magazines with marble countertops and infinity pools. It was a weathered, sturdy structure that smelled of cedar and possibility. But to me, standing on that porch for the first time, it felt like a miracle made of sunlight and salt air. The windows were tall and open, framing an endless expanse of blue water, the waves whispering against the shore instead of the traffic screaming that I was used to. The first evening, I sat barefoot on the wooden deck, watching the horizon melt into gold and violet, feeling something so unfamiliar it took me a moment to name it. Peace. Peace without conditions. Peace without the waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was silence, but not the empty, lonely silence of my apartment in the city. It was a full, living silence, filled with the rhythm of the tide. That night, the dream beach house became reality, a tangible anchor in a life that had been drifting for too long. But just as I began to believe I had escaped the noise of my past, just as the knot in my stomach began to loosen for the first time in a decade, my phone rang. It sat on the counter, buzzing angrily, the screen illuminating the dim room. My mother's name lit the screen, and instantly, a knot formed in my stomach, tight and cold. I almost ignored it. I almost let it go to voicemail, but guilt is a stubborn habit, ingrained in me since childhood. It's a reflex, a Pavlovian response to the sound of her ringtone. I answered, my voice tight. She didn't greet me. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask about the move or if I was okay. Her voice carried the same authority it always had, the tone that assumed my compliance before I even had a chance to speak. "We're moving in tomorrow," she said. "Your dad said it's fine." For a second, my mind refused to process the sentence. The words floated there, absurd and heavy in the salt air, completely out of place. I just froze. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air tighter, as if the ocean itself had retreated, leaving me high and dry. I managed a weak, confused laugh, my voice sounding hollow to my own ears, thinking it had to be a joke, a prank, a misunderstanding. But silence answered me. A cold, expectant silence. Then she spoke again, her voice colder, sharper, like a knife sliding from a sheath. "If you don't like it, you can find somewhere else." The audacity of it hit like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. This was my house, my money, my risk. My fragile, desperate attempt at rebuilding a life that had never truly belonged to me. Yet somehow, in her mind, it was already theirs. My hand shook so badly I had to grip the edge of the kitchen counter, the wood biting into my palm. Old emotions rushed back in a tidal wave. Anger, disbelief, that familiar childhood helplessness that made me feel like I was 6 years old again, small and powerless. Growing up, my parents had always treated my achievements like communal property. My scholarships were family victories to be bragged about at parties. My first paycheck was immediately allotted for bills. My salary was family support. My boundaries were inconveniences to be bulldozed. My room was never really my room. It was storage for their things. Distance had not changed their expectations. It had only delayed them. I could hear my father faintly in the background, not speaking, just existing as silent reinforcement, a passive observer to the hostile takeover of my life. That hurt more than if he had argued. His silence was his approval. I should have protested. I should have shouted. I should have told her exactly where she could go. Instead, years of conditioning forced politeness into my voice, a defense mechanism I couldn't turn off. I asked questions I already knew the answers to. How long? Why? What about my space? My mother brushed everything aside with casual entitlement, speaking of my home like a vacation rental they had booked online, discussing which room they would take, where they would put their things. When the call ended, the house that had felt like a sanctuary minutes earlier now felt invaded, contaminated by the weight of their arrival. The gold sunset seemed mocking now, illuminating a prison rather than a paradise. I paced the living room for hours, the floorboards creaking under my restless feet. Rage and panic wrestled inside me, a chaotic storm that left me breathless. Selling the house was impossible. I had just poured everything into it. Letting them take over was unthinkable. It would be the death of the self I was trying to build. Every scenario left me cornered. I felt the walls closing in, the suffocating weight of a life lived for others pressing down on me. But beneath the fear, deep in the part of me that had finally found the courage to quit that job, something else began to form. A slow, steady clarity. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trapped in their house under their roof, dependent on their approval for my survival. This time, the ground was mine. The deed was in my name. The rules were mine. And suddenly, the trembling stopped. The anxiety hardened into something solid and sharp, resolve. If they wanted to claim my peace, they would have to confront a version of me they had never met. They didn't know the woman who sat by the ocean and planned a future. They only knew the girl who caved. By dawn, as the gray light began to seep into the room, my shock had transformed into a plan. I replayed my mother's words. "We're moving in tomorrow." I played them over and over, not as a threat, but as a countdown. They expected obedience. They expected accommodation. They expected surrender. They expected the same Brittany who bent, who adjusted, who sacrificed her spine for their comfort. They had no idea how much I had changed, how much silence had taught me. As sunlight flooded the room, I stood at the window, staring at the waves rolling endlessly forward, unstoppable, unapologetic. My parents believed they were arriving to occupy my home. In reality, they were walking directly into a lesson years in the making. My hands shook, but I smiled. A small, cold smile. I prepared a surprise for their arrival. Morning arrived wrapped in a deceptive calm, the kind that makes everything look harmless just before something irreversible happens. I woke early, not from anxiety, but from a strange electric focus. The plan I had shaped through the night sat firmly in my mind, clear and immovable. There would be no screaming match, no emotional explosion my parents could twist into proof of my instability or hormonal imbalance. That was their favorite tactic, declare me dramatic, unhinged, ungrateful. No, this would be precise, controlled, unforgettable. I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, as if preparing a stage. Every object had a purpose now. Every detail mattered. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was the landlord, the judge, the executioner of the status quo. By the time the sun climbed over the water, painting the waves in liquid gold, my beach house no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like a courtroom without a judge. A place where truth would finally speak without interruption. I sat at the dining table, 3 thick folders resting neatly in front of me, my hands folded in my lap, waiting. My parents arrived exactly as my mother had promised. Their SUV rolled into the driveway with the confidence of people who believed they were expected, who believed they owned the very asphalt they parked on. I watched from the window, heart steady, hands no longer trembling. My mother stepped out first, scanning the property with open satisfaction, already treating it as hers. She pointed to the garden, making a comment to my father about what needed changing. My father followed, carrying that same passive expression he had worn my entire life. Not cruel, not kind, simply absent when it mattered most. A statue of a man. They didn't knock. Of course they didn't. Why would they knock on their own property? My mother pushed the door open and entered like a victor crossing a finish line, bringing the smell of exhaust and entitlement with her. "Brittany, you really should have cleaned the entryway," she called out, her voice echoing through my home. Criticism arriving before affection, as always. The first words out of her mouth were a judgment on my housekeeping, a staking of territory. It was so predictable it was almost funny. I walked out from the dining room and greeted them with a calm smile that immediately unsettled her. She stopped in her tracks, her eyes narrowing slightly. She expected resistance. She expected tears or forced enthusiasm or the defeated slump of my shoulders. She did not expect composure. That was the first crack in their narrative. Before she could say anything else, before she could direct them to the guest room or criticize the furniture, I spoke. My voice was even, polite, but devoid of the warmth they usually fed on. "I prepared something for you," I said. Curiosity flickered across her face, quickly replaced by suspicion. "Prepared what? We just want to get settled, Brittany. The drive was long." My father shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, but said nothing. He was a barometer for tension, and the needle was spiking. I led them into the living room. The table was bare except for 3 thick manila folders, heavy with paper, and 2 chairs positioned opposite my single chair. A tribunal. The sight alone changed the air in the room. The sound of the waves outside seemed to quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath. My mother's expression tightened. Paperwork had never meant anything pleasant in our family unless it benefited them. A car title, a loan application, a will. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice losing the patronizing sweetness. "Receipts," I answered simply. "Agreements, records, everything connected to the last 10 years of my life." Confusion gave way to irritation. She laughed dismissively, waving a hand as if to shoo away a fly. "Oh, please, Brittany, don't start with the drama. We just drove for hours. We're tired. Is this about the entryway? It was just a joke." But I didn't react. I didn't smile. I didn't apologize. I simply opened the first folder and slid it toward her. The sound of the paper sliding across the wood was loud in the silence. Inside were pages upon pages, bank transfers, copies of checks, loan repayments, utility bills that were in my name but paid for their house, medical expenses for their dogs, insurance coverage for their cars. Even documented conversations, screenshots of texts where I was guilted into sending money. Numbers, dates, evidence. The color drained from her face as understanding slowly, painfully replaced arrogance. She picked up a page, her eyes scanning the rows of figures. My father leaned closer, adjusting his glasses, his eyes narrowing. Silence spread heavily through the room, thick and suffocating. It was a financial autopsy of my exploitation. "I tracked every financial favor," I said, my voice steady, almost detached like a prosecutor reading an indictment. "Every time I was told family helps family," I wrote it down. "Every rent payment I covered when you fell behind. Every car repair, every emergency, every time my independence was postponed for your comfort." My mother's composure fractured. The mask slipped, revealing the raw anger underneath. "Are you seriously trying to bill your parents?" she hissed. "Is this some kind of joke? This is what we raised you to do. Count pennies against your own flesh and blood." "I'm establishing boundaries," I corrected softly. "Legally and permanently." Then came the second part of the surprise. I placed a single sheet of paper on top of the folders. A formal document, a short-term rental agreement. Their names were already printed in the blank spaces. The rent was listed as 0 for the first week, but the terms were strict. It was a contract. My mother stared at it, her eyes darting between the paper and my face. Disbelief was battling fury, and fury was losing. "You said you were moving in," I continued, my voice calm. "But this is my house. No one lives here without my terms. If you stay as tenants. Temporary, conditional, respectful, and you sign this." The explosion I had expected finally came. My mother's voice rose sharp and incredulous, accusations pouring out like venom. "Selfish, ungrateful. After everything we did for you, we raised you, we fed you. And you treat us like strangers, like tenants. "You are ridiculous, Brittany. You need help. This is insane." The familiar arsenal of guilt and outrage. The same weapons she had used for 27 years. But something extraordinary happened. For the first time, her words had nowhere to land. They bounced off the walls of the house I owned. They bounced off the folders full of evidence. They bounced off the new, hardened shell I had built in the quiet of this beach house. She no longer controlled anything. Not the house, not the situation, not me. My father, usually silent, spoke at last. His voice was strained, uncertain. "Brittany, this is extreme. This is too much." "No," I replied quietly, looking him in the eye. "What was extreme was assuming you could take my life whenever it suited you. What was extreme was calling me up and telling me I was being evicted from my own home before you even arrived." The confrontation stretched painfully, reality pressing against expectations that refused to collapse gracefully. My mother's anger eventually gave way to something rarer: uncertainty. She looked around the room, at the beautiful view, at the sturdy walls, at her daughter sitting there like a stranger. She looked not with ownership, but with the dawning recognition of exclusion. She realized she was a guest, and guests can be asked to leave. They had arrived believing authority traveled with them, that parenthood was a monarchy that extended across state lines and property deeds. Instead, they had encountered a closed system they could not dominate, a sovereign nation of one. "I love you," I said finally, and the sincerity of it stunned them into silence. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was a statement of fact. But love without respect is just control wearing a kinder mask, and that ends here, right now, in this house. No shouting followed, no dramatic storming out, just a heavy, uncomfortable stillness as my parents stood there, stripped of assumptions they had carried for decades. The balance of power had shifted so completely it left no room for argument. They stood in the ruins of their entitlement. They could accept my terms, the humble, humiliating position of tenants in their daughter's house, or they could leave. For once, the choice was entirely theirs and entirely powerless. They did not sign the paper. To sign it would be to admit the new reality, and perhaps their pride couldn't swallow that pill. When they walked back toward the door, their steps were heavy. My mother looked smaller, shrunken into her coat. My father looked older, his face etched with a confusion he couldn't voice. Not defeated, perhaps, but confronted by something unfamiliar. Consequence. I watched them drive away from the deck where I had once dreamed of peace, the ocean roaring softly behind me like quiet applause. The SUV disappeared down the road, taking the noise and the demands and the guilt with it. The fear that had defined my life for so long dissolved into something lighter, stronger. Certainty. Some victories are loud, explosive, cinematic. They involve shouting matches and overturned tables. Mine was silent, precise, far more devastating. Because the welcome I prepared was not revenge, it wasn't cruelty, it wasn't rage. It was independence, documented and undeniable. It was the simple, terrifying act of saying no and meaning it. And as I stood there, breathing in the salt air that belonged only to me, I knew the healing had finally, truly begun.